The fluorescent lights of Miller's diner buzzed with that electric hum that only got louder as the night dragged on, and Sarah Chen felt every hour of her double shift pressing down on her shoulders like physical weight. She'd been on her feet for 14 hours straight, moving between tables with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes anymore, refilling coffee cups and delivering plates of comfort food to customers who barely looked up from their phones long enough to say thank you. The rain had started around 7 that evening, a steady downpour that turned the streets outside into rivers of reflected neon, and it showed no signs of letting up anytime soon. Sarah pushed a strand of dark hair behind her ear as she wiped down table 6 for what felt like the 100th time that day, her lower back screaming in protest with every movement. But she couldn't afford to slow down, couldn't afford to show weakness, not when her mother's medical bills were stacking up faster than she could pay them, and her younger brother's college tuition was due in 2 weeks. The diner was one of those old-school places that time seemed to have forgotten, with red vinyl booths that were cracked and patched with duct tape, a black and white checkered floor that had seen better decades, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked since 1987, but nobody had the heart to throw away. Miller's had been a neighborhood institution for 40 years, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the coffee was always hot and the pie was always fresh. But lately things had been different. Corporate had bought out Old Man Miller 6 months ago, and suddenly everything was about profit margins and efficiency reports, about cutting costs and maximizing revenue, and the warm family atmosphere that had made the place special was slowly being strangled by spreadsheets and policies. Sarah had worked at Miller's for 3 years, ever since she'd dropped out of nursing school to take care of her mother after the cancer diagnosis, and in that time she'd seen 5 managers come and go, each one colder and more corporate than the last. The current manager, Derek Thornton, was a sharp-suited man in his mid-30s, who'd never worked a day of actual service in his life, but had an MBA from some prestigious school and loved to remind everyone about it. He ran the diner like it was a Fortune 500, implementing policies that made no sense for a small neighborhood restaurant, like the new rule that said employees couldn't give away food under any circumstances, not even day-old pastries that would just get thrown away, because waste was waste and giving things away set a bad precedent. Sarah thought the policy was cruel and short-sighted, but she needed this job too badly to argue, so she kept her head down and followed the rules, even when every instinct told her they were wrong. The dinner rush had been brutal, one of those nights where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, where orders got mixed up and the kitchen fell behind and customers got angry, and Sarah had to smile through it all, apologizing for things that weren't her fault, and trying to keep everyone happy while her feet throbbed in her worn-out sneakers, and her tips barely covered her bus fare home. Now, at 11:45 at night, the diner was finally empty, except for one old man nursing a cup of decaf in the corner booth, and Sarah was counting down the minutes until midnight when she could finally clock out and drag herself home to her tiny studio apartment, where her cat and a microwave dinner would be waiting. She moved methodically through her closing duties, wiping tables and refilling salt shakers and rolling silverware into napkins, her mind already drifting toward tomorrow's early shift at the grocery store where she worked part-time, calculating in her head how many hours of sleep she might actually get if the bus wasn't too delayed. The rain drummed against the windows like impatient fingers, and somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, just another sound in the urban symphony that never really stopped in this city that Sarah had lived in her whole life, but never really felt like she belonged to. She was invisible here, just another struggling working-class girl trying to keep her head above water in an economy that seemed designed to drown people like her, and most days she was too tired to even be angry about it anymore. Sarah was rolling the last set of silverware when she noticed the man outside, a dark silhouette pressed against the rain-streaked window, his face barely visible through the condensation and the reflected neon from the open sign that Derek never remembered to turn off. At first she thought he was just another late-night wanderer waiting for someone or checking his phone, but then she saw the way he was looking into the diner, with an intensity that made her stop what she was doing and really look back. He was old, probably in his 60s or 70s, though it was hard to tell with people who lived on the streets because the weather and the hardship aged them in ways that had nothing to do with actual years. His clothes were soaked through, hanging off his thin frame in layers that might have been multiple shirts or just one very tattered coat, and his hair was long and grey and plastered to his skull by the rain. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. Even from across the diner she could see them, and they weren't the glazed or vacant eyes she'd sometimes seen on people who'd given up. They were sharp and aware, and desperately hungry. The old man in the corner booth had left 5 minutes ago, slipping out into the rain with his newspaper tucked under his arm, which meant Sarah was alone in the front of house, with Derek somewhere in the back office doing paperwork and the night cook, Lewis, cleaning down the kitchen before his shift ended. She should have ignored the man at the window, should have gone back to her closing duties and pretended she hadn't seen him, because she knew the policy and she knew what Derek would say. But something about the way he was standing there so still and so focused, like looking at food through that window, was the most important thing in the world, made her feet move before her brain could stop them. She walked to the door and pushed it open, and immediately the sound of rain intensified, drumming on the awning above her head, and the smell of wet asphalt and ozone filled her nose. The man stepped back, his eyes going wide like he hadn't expected anyone to actually acknowledge his existence, and Sarah got a better look at him now, saw the deep lines etched into his face, the way his hands were shaking slightly, whether from cold or hunger or something else she couldn't tell. He hadn't shaved in weeks, maybe months, and his beard was mostly grey with streaks of darker colour, and there was a scar above his left eyebrow that looked old and faded. He was carrying a backpack that looked like it had been through a war, held together with rope and duct tape, and his shoes were falling apart, the sole of the left one flapping with each small movement he made. Sarah felt her heart clench in her chest, that familiar ache she got whenever she saw someone who'd fallen through the cracks of society, because she knew how close she was to that edge herself, knew that a few missed paychecks or one more medical emergency could push her into that same desperate space. The man didn't speak, just looked at her with those sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed incongruous with his appearance, and Sarah realized he was waiting for her to say something, to either invite him in or tell him to leave. The rain was getting heavier now, coming down in sheets that turned the street beyond into a blur of darkness and reflected light, and Sarah made a decision that she knew might cost her job but couldn't seem to stop herself from making. She stepped aside and gestured for him to come in, and after a moment of hesitation, the man shuffled past her into the warm, bright interior of the diner, bringing with him the smell of rain and old clothes and something else, something like wood smoke and earth. He stood just inside the door, dripping onto the checkered floor, and Sarah could see him more clearly now, could see the intelligence in his face beneath the grime and the beard, could see the way he held himself with a strange kind of dignity despite his circumstance. She grabbed a towel from behind the counter and handed it to him, and he took it with a nod that seemed almost formal, like he was remembering manners from some previous life when things had been different. Sarah knew she was breaking the rules, knew that what she was about to do could get her fired, but the sight of the old man standing there dripping and shaking had awakened something in her that was stronger than fear of consequences. She led him to a booth in the back corner, away from the windows where Derek might see if he came out of his office, and told him to sit down, which he did with a slowness that spoke of aching joints and exhausted muscles. The man looked around the diner like he was memorizing every detail, his gaze lingering on the menu board above the counter, the photographs of pies and burgers and breakfast specials that probably looked like impossible luxuries to someone who didn't know where his next meal was coming from. Sarah could hear her heart pounding in her ears as she made her way back to the kitchen, where Luis was wiping down the grill and humming some song she didn't recognize. She caught his eye and he looked at her, then glanced toward the dining room where the homeless man was sitting, and something passed between them, some unspoken understanding, because Luis had grown up poor too, had known what it was like to be hungry, and he gave her the smallest nod before turning away to give her plausible deniability. Sarah moved quickly, grabbing a plate and loading it with food that would have been thrown away anyway, a burger that had been sitting under the heat lamp for too long, fries that were past their prime, but still perfectly edible, a side of coleslaw that was from yesterday's batch. She added a piece of apple pie, slightly stale but still good, and poured a large cup of coffee, black and strong, the way her father used to drink it before he died when she was 12. Her hands were shaking as she carried the plate back out to the dining room, her mind racing through all the ways this could go wrong, imagining Derek coming out of his office and demanding to know what she thought she was doing, imagining the write-up or the termination or the lecture about policies and procedures and setting bad precedents. But when she set the plate down in front of the homeless man and saw the way his eyes widened, saw the naked gratitude that crossed his face before he could hide it behind a mask of dignified composure, she knew she'd made the right choice, regardless of what it might cost her. The man looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and Sarah realized there were tears gathering in the corners of his eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, seeming to struggle with words, and finally he just nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed more thanks than any speech could have. Sarah told him to take his time, that there was no rush, and she went back to her closing duties, trying to act normal, trying not to watch as the man ate with careful, deliberate movements, not wolfing down the food like she'd expected, but savoring each bite like it was a gourmet meal instead of diner fare that had seen better hours. She was refilling the napkin dispensers when she heard Derek's office door open, and her stomach dropped like a stone, but when she looked up he was walking toward the back exit, his expensive jacket over his arm, apparently leaving early without doing his final walkthrough, which was against protocol but not uncommon for Derek, who considered himself above the rules he enforced so strictly on everyone else. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, thinking she'd gotten away with it, thinking she'd managed to do one good thing in a day full of exhausting monotony. She finished her closing duties and counted out her tips, $37.53, barely enough to cover her bus fare and groceries for the next 2 days, and by the time she looked back toward the corner booth the homeless man was gone, the plate empty and placed neatly at the edge of the table, and sitting beside it was a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. Sarah picked up the folded paper with curiosity, thinking maybe the old man had left a note of thanks, but before she could open it she heard the back door slam and heavy footsteps coming toward the dining room, and she turned to see Derek striding toward her with his phone in his hand, and an expression on his face that made her blood run cold. He'd been watching the security cameras from his car, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, because he'd had a feeling something wasn't right, and sure enough there she was on camera feeding some vagrant like this. Was a charity kitchen instead of a business that needed to turn a profit. Sarah tried to explain, tried to tell him about the man standing in the rain, about the food that would have been wasted anyway, about basic human decency and compassion, but Derek cut her off with a sharp gesture that made her flinch. He launched into a lecture about policies and procedures, about how rules existed for a reason, about how giving away food created liability issues, and encouraged loitering and made the diner look like an easy target for every homeless person in the neighborhood who wanted a handout. Sarah stood there taking it, her face burning with shame and anger, the folded note still clutched in her hand, and she realized that Derek wasn't just angry about the policy violation, he was angry about being disobeyed, about having his authority questioned by someone he considered beneath him, a mere waitress who should have known her place. The lecture went on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Derek pacing back and forth in the empty diner, his voice getting louder and more theatrical, like he was rehearsing for some corporate presentation on the importance of following protocol. He talked about setting examples and maintaining standards, about how he couldn't play favorites, and how this was going to have consequences, and Sarah felt something inside her begin to shift, a sort of resignation mixed with defiance, because she realized in that moment that she was going to lose this job no matter what she said, and maybe that was okay, maybe being fired for doing the right thing was better than keeping a job that required her to ignore her conscience. When Derek finally wound down his tirade, he pulled out his phone and started typing, and Sarah knew he was documenting everything for his report, creating a paper trail that would justify the termination he'd already decided on. He told her she was fired effective immediately, that she should collect her things and leave her uniform in the back, that her final paycheck would be mailed to her address on file, and that if she caused any trouble or tried to make this difficult he would make sure she never worked in food service in this city again. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself, wanted to point out the hypocrisy of a man who left work early regularly and took food home without paying for it, lecturing her about stealing, but she was too tired and too defeated to fight. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak without her voice breaking, and she turned away from Derek's satisfied smirk and walked toward the back room where her purse and jacket were hanging in her locker. Louis was still there, pretending to organize supplies but clearly having heard everything, and when Sarah came in he looked at her with sympathy and anger, and he told her in Spanish that Derek was a bastard and that she deserved better. And Sarah managed a weak smile of thanks before grabbing her things and heading for the back door. She stepped out into the rain, which had lessened to a steady drizzle, and she stood there for a moment letting the water soak through her clothes, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on her shoulder. She'd lost her main source of income. She had no idea how she was going to pay her bills. Her mother's medication alone cost more than she could afford, and all because she'd given a meal to a hungry man. Sarah walked through the rain-soaked streets toward the bus stop, her mind numb with shock and exhaustion, the reality of her situation slowly sinking in like water through fabric. She had maybe $300 in her bank account, rent was due in a week, her mother's prescription needed to be refilled in 3 days, and her brother had been counting on her contribution to help with his textbooks this semester. She'd have to find another job fast, but who was going to hire someone who'd just been fired for stealing, because that's how Derek would spin it? She had no doubt. She reached the bus stop, a sad little shelter with graffiti-covered plastic walls and a bench that was always slightly damp, no matter the weather, and she collapsed onto it, suddenly aware of how much her feet hurt, how much everything hurt. That's when she remembered the note, still clutched in her hand, slightly damp now from the rain. She unfolded it carefully, expecting maybe a few words of thanks, some generic blessing like she'd seen written on cardboard signs held by people asking for change, but what she found instead made her breath catch in her throat. The handwriting was neat and precise, almost elegant, the kind of penmanship that came from another era when people still wrote letters by hand, and the message was strange, cryptic in a way that made her heart start beating faster. It said, "Thank you for your kindness when you had no obligation to show it. Your compassion in a moment when you thought no one important was watching says more about your character than any resume ever could. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., please come to the address below. Ask for Mr. Harrison. What you did tonight was a test, though you had no way of knowing it, and you passed with flying colors. Your life is about to change." Below the message was an address in the financial district, a part of the city Sarah rarely had reason to visit, where glass towers full of banks and corporate headquarters rose like monuments to wealth and power. She read the note 3 times, trying to make sense of it, wondering if this was some kind of cruel joke or elaborate scam, because things like this didn't happen to people like her. Fairy tale twists didn't manifest in real life for broke waitresses who'd just been fired. But something about the handwriting, about the formal phrasing, about the specificity of the address and time, made her think it might be real, made her think that maybe, impossibly, that homeless man had been something other than what he appeared. She pulled out her phone, the screen cracked from a drop she couldn't afford to repair, and searched for the address. It was the headquarters of Meridian Corporation, one of the largest restaurant and hospitality conglomerates in the country, as a company that owned hundreds of chains and independent restaurants, including, she realized with a jolt, the corporate entity that had bought out Miller's Diner 6 months ago. Sarah felt her head spinning, trying to connect the dots, trying to understand what was happening. Had that homeless man been some kind of corporate spy, some undercover boss situation like she'd seen on TV shows that seemed too ridiculous to be real? But why would someone from Meridian Corporation be testing employees at a random diner in the middle of the night? And what did any of this have to do with? The more she thought about it, the less sense it made, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the note was legitimate, that tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., her life really might change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The bus arrived, its brakes squealing, and Sarah climbed aboard, her mind racing with possibilities and doubts, the note carefully folded and tucked into her pocket where she could feel its presence, like a talisman against the disaster of this night. She spent the 40-minute ride home, staring out the rain-streaked window, watching the city slide past in blurs of light and shadow, and for the first time in years she felt something that might have been hope flickering in her chest, fragile as a candle flame, but stubbornly refusing to go out. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Couldn't sleep, her mind churning through scenarios and possibilities. each one more unlikely than the last. She must have picked up her phone 100 times to look at the address again, to confirm it was real, to search for information about Meridian Corporation and its executives. What she found was impressive and intimidating in equal measure. Meridian was worth billion, had operations in 12 countries, employed over 50,000 people, and was run by a CEO named James Harrison, who was something of a legend in the business world, known for his unconventional methods and his philosophy that the best way to understand a company was from the ground up. There were articles about him going undercover in his own restaurants, about his belief that character mattered more than credentials, about his reputation for spotting talent in unlikely places and promoting people who showed initiative and integrity. Sarah read everything she could find, and slowly a picture emerged that made the night's events seem less impossible, though no less surreal. By the time morning came, she'd convinced herself that she had nothing to lose by going to the address, that even if it was a mistake or a misunderstanding, at least she'd know, at least she wouldn't spend the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she'd been brave enough to show up. She dressed in her only interview outfit, simple black skirt and white blouse, that she'd bought at a thrift store 3 years ago for a job fair that had led nowhere, and she took 2 buses to reach the financial district, arriving at the Meridian Corporation headquarters at 8:40, 15 minutes early, because her mother had always taught her that punctuality showed respect. The building was everything she'd expected and more, a sleek tower of glass and steel that seemed to touch the clouds, with a lobby that looked like something from a magazine, all marble floors and modern art and leather furniture that probably cost more than she made in a year. Sarah felt completely out of place, like an actor who'd wandered onto the wrong set, and she had to fight the urge to turn around and leave before anyone noticed she didn't belong there. But she'd come this far, and something stubborn in her nature, the same quality that had made her open the door to a homeless man, despite knowing the consequences, pushed her forward to the reception desk where a polished woman in an expensive suit looked up with a professional smile. Sarah's voice came out smaller than she'd intended when she said she was there to see Mr. Harrison, and she half expected the receptionist to laugh or call security, but instead the woman's expression shifted to something like recognition, and she made a quick phone call before directing Sarah to a private elevator that would take her directly to the executive floor. The elevator ride seemed to last forever, the numbers climbing impossibly high, and Sarah watched her reflection in the polished doors, seeing a tired young woman with dark circles under her eyes, and cheap clothes and no business being in a place like this. The doors opened onto a floor that was even more impressive than the lobby, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the entire city, and a receptionist desk where another impeccably dressed woman greeted her by name, as if she'd been expected, as if this was all somehow planned. Sarah was led down a hallway lined with photographs of restaurants and smiling employees, and then into a corner office that was larger than her entire apartment, with windows on 2 walls and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. And there, standing by the window with his back to her, was a man in an expensive charcoal suit, his silver hair catching the morning light, and when he turned around, Sarah's world tilted sideways because she recognized him instantly despite the transformation. It was him, the homeless man from the night before, except he wasn't homeless at all. He was clean-shaven and perfectly groomed, wearing clothes that probably cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe, and looking every inch the powerful executive that the internet had told her James Harrison was. Sarah felt her legs go weak, felt the room spin slightly, and she had to steady herself against the doorframe as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Harrison smiled, a gentle expression that reminded her of the way he'd looked at her last night when she'd set that plate of food in front of him, and he gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. His voice when he spoke was warm and cultured, nothing like the silence he'd maintained during their encounter at the diner, and he began to explain what Sarah had stumbled into without knowing it. Meridian Corporation had bought Miller's Diner and 15 other small restaurants in the city 6 months ago, he said, and there had been concerns about the management structure that had been put in place, concerns about whether the company's values were being upheld at the ground level, where it actually mattered. Harrison had built his empire on a simple philosophy that the true measure of a business wasn't in its quarterly reports or its profit margins, but in how it treated people, both customers and employees, especially when no one important was watching. He'd made a habit over the years of going undercover in his own establishments, usually without warning, to see how things really operated when the corporate brass wasn't around. Last night had been one of those operations, he explained, though he hadn't expected anything particularly dramatic. He just wanted to see how Miller's diner ran during the late shift, how the employees behaved when they thought no one was watching. What he'd found instead was Sarah, and what happened next had told him everything he needed to know, not just about Miller's diner but about the person standing in front of him now. He'd seen her exhaustion, seen how hard she was working, seen the moment when she'd noticed him at the window, and the decision she'd made despite knowing the risk. He'd watched from the booth as she'd prepared food she wasn't supposed to give away, watched her check nervously for her manager, watched her bring that plate to him with hands that shook slightly, but with a determination that spoke of deep conviction. And then, because he'd left a listening device on the table disguised as a napkin holder, he'd heard everything that happened after he'd left, heard Derek's tirade and Sarah's firing, heard the way she'd maintained her dignity even when being berated for doing the right thing. Harrison had been furious, he admitted, not at Sarah but at Derek, at the kind of management culture that valued policies over people, that created environments where showing basic human kindness was a fireable offense. He'd already sent notice that morning that Derek was being terminated, and that the manager position at Miller's Diner would be filled by someone who actually understood what hospitality meant. But that wasn't why he'd asked Sarah to come here, he said, leaning forward with an intensity that made her feel like he was really seeing her, not just looking at her the way most people did, like she was invisible or interchangeable. He was offering her a job, he said, not as a waitress but as something more, something that would use her instincts and her compassion and her ability to see people as human beings rather than transactions. Meridian Corporation was expanding its training program, creating a new position focused on developing management talent from within the ranks, finding people who had the character and values that couldn't be taught in business school. He wanted Sarah to join that program, to work directly with him and his team, to help identify and nurture the kind of leadership that put people first. Sarah sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what she was hearing, trying to believe that this was really happening, and not some exhaustion-induced hallucination brought on by too many double shifts and too little sleep. Harrison was offering her a salary that was more than double what she'd been making at her 3 part-time jobs combined, plus benefits that included health insurance that would cover her mother's treatments, plus tuition assistance that would help her brother finish college, plus opportunities for advancement that seemed impossible for someone with her background and her incomplete education. It was everything she needed and more, everything she'd been struggling toward for years, without ever believing she might actually reach it, and the only thing he was asking in return was that she bring the same instincts and values to this new role that she'd shown last night in that diner. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes, felt her throat tightening with emotion that she'd been holding back for so long, all the stress and fear and exhaustion of the past few years suddenly crashing over her like a wave. She tried to speak, tried to find words adequate to express what this meant to her, but all that came out was a choked sound that might have been a laugh or a sob or both. Harrison pushed a box of tissues across the desk with a knowing smile, and he told her it was okay, that he understood, that he'd been where she was once, struggling and scared and wondering if things would ever get better. He'd built Meridian from nothing, he said, starting with a single coffee shop 30 years ago when he was barely older than Sarah was now, and he'd never forgotten what it felt like to be invisible, to work hard and get nowhere, to have people look through you like you didn't matter. That's why he ran his company the way he did, why he believed in testing character over credentials, why he'd spent last night standing in the rain outside a diner, waiting to see if anyone inside would remember that compassion mattered more than policy. Sarah wiped her eyes and took a deep breath, and she asked him why this particular test, why he'd chosen Miller's Diner on that specific night. Harrison's expression became thoughtful, and he explained that he ran these operations regularly at all the restaurants his company acquired, that last night hadn't been special except in what it revealed. He'd been to Miller's several times over the past month during different shifts, watching how things operated, and he'd noticed how she treated customers with genuine warmth, how she helped the other servers when they fell behind, how she stayed positive even when things were difficult. He'd wanted to see how she'd respond when faced with a choice between following rules and following her conscience, and she'd given him his answer. The job offer was real, he assured her, pulling out a contract that had already been prepared with her name on it, and he gave her time to read through it, to ask questions, to really understand what she was agreeing to. Sarah read every word twice, hardly believing what she was seeing, and when she finally looked up, Harrison was watching her with an expression that reminded her of her father, proud and encouraging and certain of her potential even when she wasn't certain herself. She picked up the pen he offered and signed her name with a hand that only trembled slightly, and just like that her life changed. Harrison stood and extended his hand, and when Sarah shook it, she felt like she was sealing more than just an employment agreement. She was stepping through a door into a future she'd never imagined possible, a future where her kindness hadn't cost her everything, but had instead opened up opportunities she'd never dared to dream about. They talked for another hour, about logistics and start dates and training schedule, and Harrison told her she could start in 2 weeks, which would give her time to help her mother get settled with better medical care and to celebrate her brother's birthday, for the first time in years, without worrying about money. When Sarah finally left the office, walking back through that impressive building that no longer seemed quite so intimidating, she felt lighter than she had in years, like some enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She stepped out into the morning sunlight, the rain from last night completely gone, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming, and she pulled out her phone to call her mother with news that would change both their lives.